The Muslim ummah is suffering. Poverty, occupation, genocide. This is the fate that millions of Muslims across the world face on a daily basis, either by imperialist powers or by so-called Muslim leaders who time and time again betray us to maintain their wealth, prestige, and power. But why? Why is it that the Muslims, once the most thriving civilizations in human history, have been reduced to victims of humiliation and oppression? It all traces back to a single decision on the 3rd of March 1924, the abolition of the Islamic Caliphate. With the strike of a pen, the founding father of Turkey, Mustafa Kemal, officially ended Muslim unity, plunging the ummah into a century of humiliation and oppression. However, what makes the end of the Islamic Caliphate so tragic and so complex is that it did not happen overnight, but rather it was the climax of centuries of decline. Worst of all, the Ottoman Empire did not fall at the hands of enemies from the outside, but by those within. Nationalistic Muslims who blindly believe that they were on the right side of history, so much so that they overthrew their own caliph just to westernize the Ottoman Empire. It was this decision which sealed the fate of the last great caliphate in history, leading to what is happening to the Muslim ummah today. This is one of 6 episodes that delve into the collapse of the Islamic Caliphate and the rise of a secular Turkey, a nation that tried to eradicate Islam from the hearts of the Turkish people. And to understand how people like Ataturk rose to power, we need to know where it all began. This is the Broken Crescent. The Ottomans were one of the most formidable empires in human history. Stretching across 3 continents, they pioneered advancements in warfare, architecture, astronomy, law, the arts, and so much more. They also conquered Constantinople, fulfilling the hadith of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and spread Islam to faraway lands, which is why 3 European countries today now have a majority Muslim population. Most importantly, the Ottomans were the last great caliphate in Islamic history, serving as the leaders of the ummah as did other empires before them. However, just like these same empires, the Ottomans would also begin to decline for many reasons. After Suleiman the Magnificent passed away, sultans increasingly confined themselves to the comforts of their palace. To them, why march hundreds of kilometers from the capital to fight, risking their very lives when they could enjoy the luxuries of home? Then there was fratricide, the brutal Ottoman tradition where new sultans executed their own brothers to prevent civil war. While this may have kept the throne secure, it also meant that future rulers grew up isolated with no real experience in leadership or warfare. Unlike Osman I or Mehmed al-Fatih, many of these later sultans were weak, indecisive, and had no drive to fight. Their janissaries, once the backbone of the Ottoman army, became corrupt to the point where they could overthrow sultans at will. And as the empire stopped prioritizing jihad, its enemies took advantage, slowly pushing the Ottomans back. So by the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire was no longer a force to be reckoned with, being humiliated time and time again. Every single person in the Ottoman Empire knew that something had to change, but how exactly to go about it was a matter of debate. On one side, you had the Ottoman Ulema, the religious scholars, who argued that the key to solving the empire's problems was a return to Sharia law, with one even claiming that decisive and firm application of Islamic Sharia and its laws will stop the empire's decline, maintain security, and put an end to rebellions and riots in the land. If the Muslims respond to the call of returning to Sharia, they will soon return to the era of conquests. But on the other hand, the empire's elite class took a different view. They noticed that Europe was flourishing, its economies booming, its militaries modernizing, and its cities evolving into metropolises, while the Ottomans were steadily declining. The Ottomans had refused to adapt to the times, while Europe surged ahead, through industrialization and scientific wonders. It was at this point that the Ottomans made one of the many mistakes, one that not only accelerated their decline, but would ultimately seal the fate of the Caliphate itself. In 1826, the Janissaries were finally abolished, and a decade later, the Ottomans began a series of reforms known as the Tanzimat era. These changes included centralizing power, establishing European-inspired schools, new councils that slowly moved away from Sharia courts, abolishing the jizya tax, and establishing its first parliament and constitution, influenced by those in Europe. Now, to be clear, these reforms did not aim for secularism in the way that we understand it today. The Ottoman Empire remained, at its core, an Islamic caliphate, governed by Sharia law. However, these reforms had unintended consequences. They slowly shifted the mindset of the empire's elites. By adopting Western-inspired schools, the younger generation of the Ottoman Empire were now exposed to revolutionary new ideas, many of which were alien to Islam: liberalism, nationalism, secularism, and many more. Many learnt new languages like French, which introduced them to the philosophers of the French Revolution, thinkers who explicitly rejected religion in governance. Some were even able to travel to Europe, witnessing firsthand how these nations were thriving while the Ottomans were struggling. And so, a new mindset took place. These younger Muslims, convinced that the Ottoman Empire needed to catch up to the West, pushed for even more reforms, ones that would take the empire further away from its Islamic roots. Sultan Abdul Hamid II disagreed. He believed that many of the reforms had violated Islam, which is partially the reason why he would abolish the Ottoman constitution, dissolve parliament, and crack down on those who publicly supported the reforms. But by then, the momentum had already been set. That's why, in 1889, a group of students at the Imperial Medical Academy in Istanbul formed a secret movement to oppose the Sultan, an underground resistance that would eventually grow into what we now call the Young Turks. Despite their differences, the Young Turks were united under one goal: to break Abdul Hamid's grip on power and restore the Ottoman constitution and parliament, hoping that these reforms would help the empire catch up to the West. Hearing all of this, you might be asking, why would some of the most educated members of Ottoman society oppose a ruler like Abdul Hamid II? Wasn't he a great Muslim leader? He undoubtedly was. And I've already highlighted many of his beautiful qualities in this video right here. However, you need to keep in mind that while Abdul Hamid's reign was a stable one, lasting for almost 30 years, it seemed like to many at the time that the Ottomans were on the brink of collapse. Violent resistance movements were widespread across the empire, often led by various minority groups. The infighting was especially brutal in Ottoman Europe, where the overwhelming majority of Young Turks came from. Many of the Young Turks were also military officers who were deployed in these lands, where they personally witnessed nationalists who were murdering each other in a desperate attempt to secure land from a dying Ottoman Empire. To make matters worse, many of these nationalist movements were being backed by Western powers such as the British, French, and Russians. My point is that the Young Turks were genuinely worried that the Ottoman Empire was about to be carved up by these much larger European powers, similar to how Asia and Africa were colonized before them. The Ottoman Caliphate was at the risk of collapsing, and this movement were trying to prevent that from happening. So, it might appear that the Young Turks were right to oppose Abdul Hamid II. However, it must be stressed that this narrative overlooks the fact that the Sultan, Abdul Hamid II, knew about these threats to the Ottoman Empire. He knew that the West were conspiring to carve up the Ottoman Empire, which is why he constructed the Hijaz Railway to connect Istanbul with Arabia, lands that the French and British wanted. Abdul Hamid knew that uniting the ummah was vital for the caliphate's survival, which is why he had contacts with Muslim scholars and activists across the world. He knew that literacy rates were low, which is why he established training schools to educate a new generation of teachers. He knew that Zionists were planning to colonize Palestine, which is why he restricted their ability to travel in the empire. What I'm trying to say is that Abdul Hamid was well aware of the threats facing the Ottoman Empire, and he dedicated his 30 years of rule to making sure that the Islamic Caliphate remained strong. That is why it must be stressed that the Young Turks were influenced not only by the events happening in the Ottoman Empire, but also by the Western way of life. Many of the Young Turks were fascinated by French philosophers who championed ideas like nationalism and scientific rationalism, ideas that contradict Islam. Many of the Young Turks also had a Western lifestyle, which included drinking alcohol, wearing European clothes, attending ballroom dances, and even being members of Freemason lodges. All of this is important as we move on, because in 1908, when rumours spread that the British and Russians were planning to carve up Ottoman lands in Europe, the Young Turks came out of hiding, mobilized their forces against Abdul Hamid, and began their march to Istanbul. The Sultan desperately tried to stop the coup, but seeing that many in the Ottoman Empire supported the Young Turks, he feared that bloodshed was inevitable. To prevent the Ottomans from plunging into a civil war, Abdul Hamid conceded to their demands. The Young Turks had won. Crowds in support of the revolution celebrated across the major cities in the Ottoman Empire. Many demonstrations carried signs reading Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité, the French national motto. Their love for the West was made clear. Passionate speeches were also made, including one by the future Turkish nationalist Moise Tekenop, who shouted, "We want brotherhood between all peoples. We are all without regard to religion or sect. Long live the fatherland, long live freedom." The Ottoman Parliament was re-established, and Abdul Hamid was stripped of most of his power. He would later be deposed for good and kept under house arrest. With Abdul Hamid no longer in power, the Ottomans entered a new era, a parliament and constitution, which the Young Turks believed would restore stability in the empire and modernize it, much like those in Europe. However, these changes also destabilized the Ottoman Empire. Revolutionary groups, once banned under Abdul Hamid, were now free to roam their empire, spreading nationalism to their communities. Not only that, but with Abdul Hamid gone, the Young Turks were no longer united, and competing factions resorted to intimidation, electoral fraud, and violence to maintain their control over the Ottoman Parliament. All of this did not go unnoticed, as the Ottoman Empire's neighbours took advantage and swiftly moved to exploit the chaos. This is why, in October 1908, 2 months after the Young Turks took power, Bulgaria declared independence. Only days later, Austria-Hungary followed by annexing Bosnia, one of the most important Muslim lands in the Balkans. For the Bosniaks, this was catastrophic. Cut off from the Ottoman heartland, they were left vulnerable, and in the decades to come, they would face persecution, forced assimilation, and eventually genocide. At the same time, Crete, an island Abdul Hamid had fiercely protected to shield its Muslim population, was seized by Greece. The Young Turks barely reacted, sending a clear message to Europe that the new Ottoman government lacked the strength or will to defend the ummah's lands. In 1911, the empire's last holding in Africa, Libya, fell to Italy. When Abdul Hamid was in power, he was aware of Italy's colonial ambitions, which is why he made sure to keep a strong military presence in Libya. But after his downfall, the Young Turks withdrew those troops to handle the chaos at home. This was again another fatal decision because it left Italy vulnerable, encouraging Italy to invade. Despite the brave resistance of the Libyan Mujahideen, Ottomans signed a humiliating peace deal, abandoning Libya to Italian settler colonialism and brutal occupation. Then came 1912, and with it, the First Balkan War. Greece, Bulgaria, Serbia, and Montenegro all invaded. Muslim towns were burnt to the ground, massacres swept throughout the region, and hundreds of thousands of refugees poured into what remained of the Ottoman Empire. This was the most humiliating defeat of them all, because the very lands that the Young Turks came from were now ripped away from the empire they claimed to be saving. All of this was the final straw for a nationalistic faction within the Young Turk movement, the Committee of Union and Progress. They were the ones who led the revolution against Abdul Hamid in 1908, and 5 years later, as the Ottomans were losing the Balkan War, they launched a coup against the government. They seized power, turning the Ottoman Empire into a military dictatorship at the hands of 3 men. The Sultan, who was now Mehmed V, had little to no influence in this new government. On paper, he was still the Caliph of the Muslim Ummah, the Emir Mu'mineen, but in reality, Mehmed was reduced to a figurehead, a puppet for the Committee of Union and Progress. Then came World War I, the final nail in the coffin for the Ottoman Empire. Mehmed wanted the Ottomans to stay out of the war since the empire had been devastated by 5 years of conflict. However, because he was a figurehead, his opinion was ignored. Instead, the Ottoman government, fearing that staying neutral would leave them vulnerable to partition in the future, entered World War I on the side of the Germans. This turned out to be a fatal mistake, as the Ottoman Empire was ill-prepared to fight in the largest war the world had ever seen. The Ottoman army found themselves outgunned and outnumbered, fighting on multiple fronts as they suffered defeat after defeat. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers deserted from their armies, despite calls from the Sheikh ul-Islam for all Muslims to jihad against the Ottomans' enemies. If that wasn't enough, the Sharif of Mecca, Hussein bin Ali, sided with the British and attacked the Ottoman Empire in what became known as the so-called Great Arab Revolt, pitting Muslim against Muslim. It was this betrayal especially which led the Committee of Union and Progress to tighten its grip on power, especially the Islamic institutions and the Ulema. For context, before World War I, the Ulema had already been facing backlash. The Young Turk reforms had increasingly targeted Islamic institutions, with reformers demonizing the Ulema as backward zealots who refused to modernize the empire like the West. In response, the Ulema pointed out that the very reason why Europe became secular was because of the inherent flaws of Christianity and the corruption of the Catholic Church, which made reform inevitable in the West. Islam, on the other hand, had never opposed science or reason, so there was no need to secularize the Ottoman Empire. The Ulema rightfully agreed that what happened in Europe was a problem unique to Christianity, not applicable to the Islamic world whatsoever. Despite this, the reformists continued to demonize the Ulema, insisting that the Islamic institutions of the Ottoman Empire needed to change. Mustafa Sabri Effendi, the last Sheikh ul-Islam of the Ottoman Empire, famously warned that the Young Turks sought to, quote, detach Islam from the constitution, the Sheikh ul-Islam from the cabinet, and the title of Caliph from the ruler, and that a hostile hand has been treacherously stretched out against the religion of Islam. Unfortunately, his worst fears became true. Remember when I mentioned the Arab Revolt? Well, the Ottoman government used that revolt to not only justify removing the Sheikh ul-Islam from the war cabinet, but also stripping him of most of his powers. The Sharia courts were transferred to the Ministry of Justice, a bureaucratic institution modelled after Europe. The madrasas, which had trained the Ottoman ulema for generations, were transferred to the Ministry of Education, and the control of funding for masjids and schools was absorbed into the Ministry of Charitable Foundations. The Ottoman government tried convincing the ulema that these changes were necessary to uphold Sharia law, but in reality, they dismantled the very institutions that had preserved Islam for centuries. However, none of these reforms prevented the Ottomans from collapsing, because by 1918, their empire was on its last legs. With their forces pushed out of the Middle East and their population starving, the Ottoman Empire surrendered. Their lands were carved up by the British and French, setting the stage for decades of oppression and imperialist wars. The Sultan, once the leader of the most powerful Muslim empire in the world, became captive to Allied occupation, and the Ottoman Caliphate, the last great Islamic state, was on the brink of extinction. All of this paved the way for a low-ranking officer to mobilize the Turkish people and fight a war to end the occupation. Their officer became known as Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, father of the Turks. He went on to found the Republic of Turkey, and in 1924, he abolished the Caliphate for good. You might have noticed that it took me almost 20 minutes in this video to even mention Atatürk's name. That's because the Ottomans didn't just transform from an Islamic caliphate to a secular republic the moment that Atatürk came to power. Atatürk was only able to abolish the caliphate because by the time the empire collapsed, the Sultan had little real authority, reduced to a puppet under the Ottoman government. Atatürk only gained control over Islamic institutions because the Ulema was sidelined, humiliated, and Sharia law was fractured into modern bureaucracies. That is why Atatürk created the Diyanet to control and monopolize Islam. And most importantly, Atatürk was only able to secularize Turkey because many Turks had already embraced Western ideas. He didn't act alone. He had collaborators within his regime who willingly spread his reforms against Islam. You will notice that in future videos of mine, I will constantly be referring back to the final years of the Ottoman Empire as a jumping point to Atatürk's reforms. What the Young Turks started, Atatürk would later finish. What began as an empire that turned the tide of human history, spreading Islam across the world, would end up dismantled after World War I. Not simply because of his enemies, but by its own misguided rulers. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.